Sharing stories, sharing journeys, arrow.net, ARROE.net. We are unplugged and totally uncut with James Cruz.
I'm good, Arrow. How are you?
Absolutely fantastic. I got to thank you from the bottom of my heart for putting poetry out there. And I'm a poet, but you know how poets have been in the past 20 years. We've kind of had to go a different route, but you're opening up a door for a lot of people right now.
I'm doing my best.
What's that journey been like?
Well, it's been one of passion and, just being driven by, my own kind of desire to share my work with the world and then to see more work that is accessible, understandable and relatable to a larger audience. And, there's definitely, I think, a little bit of pushback from the people who have kind of controlled the direction of poetry in academia and, kind of in those crowds. But I think mostly people are really hungry for poetry they can relate to and the kind of poetry that they can use to write themselves and maybe to live a deeper, more present life.
Do you think one of the reasons why people haven't leaped all over poetry, even in their own personal lives, is because it comes with so many rules? And really, in 2022, there are no rules. Just share your spoken word.
Yeah. Exactly. You're exactly right. And that is my philosophy. When I was teaching at the University at Albany, I worked mostly with 18 and 19-year-olds, kind of introducing them to poetry for the first time. And I'll never forget someone's feedback that they left on an evaluation. He said, Professor Cruz taught me that poetry can be anything. And it's true, it can be anything. And so I usually tell people not to get bogged down in what you may have learned in high school and college, that there are all these rules. You have to worry about metaphor, simile, line break. Just enjoy the pleasure of the written word, the pleasure of the language. And the poems that I put together in my book, The Path to Kindness, just read them out loud.
Yes.
Hear the music of the language. And don't worry about what the writer meant or like picking it apart. Just worry about what it brings up in you.
That is so true. That is so true, because everybody wants to, have their own interpretation, and then they go, so what is it about? Well, no, it's not what is it about to me. What is it about to you?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's open to interpretation. I think people, again, maybe from high school, not to blame the teachers, but it's like, it's just the way we've been taught poetry for the most part and taught literature, that there is a right or wrong answer. And there's not a right or wrong answer. And you're going to encounter poems that you may not respond to or may not enjoy, but that doesn't mean you don't like poetry or that you don't love poetry.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've learned about poetry, because my first two books, which came out in the early part of the millennium, was that I set out to write 1,000 pieces of poetry. And what I realized when I went back to do the research, I found the stuff around the poetry more interesting. Have you faced anything like that, James, where it's like, oh, well, I knew what this was really about, but because I take notes all the time, this is what it's all about?
Right. Yeah, I think that's the other beautiful thing when you are in the midst of creating something. So when you're in the midst of writing, people often think when they're sitting down to write a poem, because whatever comes out doesn't match what's in their head, again, they think they're doing it wrong. And they think, oh, I don't get poetry. Like, it's supposed to match this vision I had, and my creativity took me in a different direction. It's actually supposed to do that. That's what your curiosity and creativity are meant to do. They're meant to, go to what you're drawn to or what you want to find out more about. So I've had many, many similar experiences going down that rabbit hole of, thinking I knew where a poem was going to go, doing some research, and then finding myself more interested in something else.
The book we're talking about is The Paths of Kindness. When it comes to poetry, reading it or writing it, you still have to use the power of stream thinking. In other words, be open to whatever is going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I often compare it to being in a museum and looking at pieces of art, especially, more modern art, where you may not know exactly what the artist intended, but people seem more open to, saying, oh, this painting makes me think of this, or it reminds me of this. And I think, again, you can do the same thing with poetry. I love how you talk about just staying open to what it might remind you of or what it might bring up for you. And poetry has this magical effect I've heard it compared to like a spell that we're casting when we write a poem. And so you can you might encounter a poem and then realize that you've carried it with you, and there's some little seed in that poem that hopefully plants something positive in you so that you see the world in a different way.
Are you using a writing instrument while you're writing, or are you putting it into a computer? Because you sound like somebody who has a favorite writing instrument.
I do. I just love fast writing gel pens and really plain notebooks. That's how I start, first of all. And then later on, type it up, print it out, and see how it looks. But I have to be like physically connected when I'm writing poetry.
When you talk like that, there's a thing that hit me maybe about a year ago where all of a sudden it was like, wait a second, this isn't about the now. This is dear future reader. Do you go through those moments as well?
I do, yeah. I think what we're really doing when we're writing is sort of reaching out to some future reader. We are seeking some kind of communication. And I think we can't worry too much about that when we're first in that midst of the burst of creation. But then later on, when you're going back to it, I always tell people, like, look at it with an eye toward the future, with an eye toward the universal, and like letting people in. Because if we want to share our work, we want to be able to let people in, keep that door open for others.
The importance of this book right now, James, The Paths of Kindness, it's so important because limericks were created because it was to help quell the violence that was happening in Ireland. Look at all the poetry that was written for the Central America War. It is such the spoken language of peace, and a book like this, this is the kind of stuff that I could see getting behind those walls in Russia.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think, we have to believe that kindness is our basic human nature. And even those who have maybe turned toward evil or who have been kind of lost in their own pain, to be able to see through that and to know and trust that kindness is our basic human nature, and that small acts of kindness really can change lives. That's what I think these poems are trying to show us, and that's what I'm just trying to remind myself and hopefully whoever reads this book.
How do you silence the perfectionist? Because you know how we are as writers, it's got to be perfect.
Yeah. That's been a lifelong journey for me. I'm a little over 40 years old now, and I feel like I'm just starting to get there. But even with putting together a book like this, which is a few of my own poems, but mostly by other people, that perfectionist is still alive and well. And so I don't think the vulnerability ever goes away. But what we can train ourselves to do is when we're sitting down, being creative, just remind ourselves it's about the process and enjoying the process, not the product. Well, and it's not about how other people are going to judge it.
So true, so true. It's about mindfulness, being grateful. Do you meditate? Because everything you're sharing with me are the words that I speak and live through meditation.
Yeah. I do meditate. Yes. I always say I try to meditate because it is, trial and error. But I think like poetry, meditation has gotten, and mindfulness has gotten this bad rap of like, you're supposed to have this blank, enlightened, clear, like joyful mind all the time. And it's really just about noticing what comes up and noticing your experience. And the important piece really is not judging that experience or those thoughts that come up.
So do you do the disciplines? In other words, I write early first thing in the morning, and then I do a defrag journal in the afternoon, and those are the only times I'm able to write. Do you do the same thing, or do you just as it's happening?
Yeah, very similar, actually. I start with a very strong cup of coffee in the morning and my notebook, and that is when I do most of my writing, and really I think my best writing. And I unlike a lot of people, my phone is not the first thing I reach for. I cannot open email before being creative in the morning or, getting into that work mindset. Mm-hmm. I really have to keep my mind open and just, kind of more settled in the morning almost like you're writing from that dream space,
Oh, my God, yeah.
still kind of holding on to that after sleep.
Absolutely. Are you podcasting? Because, I mean, everything that you're sharing here is, especially when it comes to poetry, people could be tapping in like an affirmation every day just to hear it.
Right. Well, I don't podcast. I do have a poetry webinar with a good friend of mine. We call it Poetry of Resilience, and so people can look for that. But you're inspiring me. Maybe I do need to think about doing this.
Yeah, because you're using words that people need right now, and when they're sitting in the front seat of their car and all that traffic, or they're at work with all that stress, it's like they need some James Cruz.
Oh, well, thank you. I try to do that through my books, but I think you're right. We just need so many of these reminders, like we're talking about, to slow down, pause, and really reflect on what's happening. And even that frustration of sitting in the traffic can be an invitation to go deeper and pause. And that's why I love poetry. You know, I'm just as reactive when things like that happen or when things don't go my way. But I can read a poem and just instantly feel that sense of settledness. Oh,
it's like the energy from the page comes out and gets you. And I think one of my favorite forms of poetry is that when you go back to it, it has a different meaning to it. The second time or the third time you're there, you're going, whoa, I never even saw that. Yeah, and that happens all the time. You know, a poem that you might think, you know, the first time you read through it, you read it again, and it just depends on what's going on in your life. And it's like, this is the best thing that's ever been written because you can connect to it. So you never are going to be able to predict what calls to you. But I always tell people, pay attention to that. Pay attention to what calls to you and what draws you in, because that's how you're going to know where your passion lies or where your curiosity wants to take you. You talked about books and things like that. Where can listeners go where they can show you a lot of love, James, and really start supporting you? Well, social media is a great place. I am on Instagram at james.cruz.poet, and I post lots of poems, prompts, my own, others, and I'm on Facebook. People can also go to my website, jamescruz.net, and that's CREWS, and sign up for weekly poems and prompts that I send out. And you can find the books that I put together for folks really anywhere you get books. I usually say try out your local independent bookstore first, please, if you can. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, my God. To me, those are the heroes of the local community, the people that are struggling every day to keep those bookstores open. That's right. They are doing the work. And I have to say, you know, these books that I'm putting together would not be selling as well if the folks at independent bookstores were not supporting them, because they are also tuned into what people need nowadays. So true. James, you got to come back to this show anytime in the future. The door is always going to be open, and I do mean that. It's always going to be open for you. Well, this has been a pleasure. I could talk to you all day, so thank you so much for having me. Well, you be brilliant today, okay, sir? All right, thank you.